The Oakhaven neighborhood exhaled its usual sigh of weary resignation as dusk settled, painting the grimy brick and boarded up windows in shades of purple and gray. Elijah Vance, a man whose own spirit often mirrored the neighborhood's fatigue, pulled his threadbare jacket tighter. At 47, his face was etched with the kind of sorrow that settles deep, a constant companion since his wife, Sarah, had been stolen by illness 3 years prior. His job as a youth services counselor, a role that had once been his anchor, had vanished with budget cuts not long after, leaving him adrift in a sea of gig work and mounting bills. Tonight, it was a night security shift at a derelict commercial building, the pay barely enough to keep the lights on in his small apartment. He was a good man, Elijah. His shoulders, though stooped with a quiet grief, were broad enough to have once carried the hopes of many troubled kids. Now, they mostly carried the weight of his own solitude. He performed his duties with a practiced diligence, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous, empty spaces of the building, a hollow sound that matched the ache in his chest. Around 2 a.m., during a brief, unsanctioned break, Elijah decided against the longer, better-lit route back to his small security kiosk. A shortcut through a narrow, refuse-strewn alley beckoned, one he usually avoided, its shadows typically holding nothing but stray cats and the ghosts of Oakhaven's forgotten promises. But tonight, a biting wind urged him on. Halfway through, a sound pricked his ears, cutting through the urban hum, muffled voices, sharp and angry. Then a softer sound, a choked sob. They were coming from the abandoned warehouse that backed onto the alley, its windows dark, jagged teeth against the faint city glow. An old instinct, buried beneath layers of personal loss and present hardship, stirred within him. The protector, the counselor, the man who couldn't stand by when someone was hurting, that Elijah, long dormant, twitched awake. He moved closer, silent as a shadow, his heart thumping a nervous rhythm against his ribs. A grimy, cracked window pane, lower than the others, offered a sliver of a view into the cavernous interior, lit by a single, bare bulb hanging precariously from a wire. What he saw made the cold night air freeze in his lungs. A young woman, barely more than a girl, stood trembling in the center of a small, menacing group. Her eyes, wide and dark with terror, darted around like a trapped animal's. Elijah recognized 2 of the figures immediately: Reginald, Reggie, Collins, and his wife, Brenda. Local fixtures in Oakhaven, known for their shifty dealings and general air of unpleasantness. Reggie, wiry and mean-eyed, had Maya, for that's who Elijah realized she must be, their seldom-seen daughter, by the arm, his grip like a vise. Brenda, heavier set with a permanently sour expression, watched with cold indifference. The third man was Marcus "Shark" Stokes, a low-level criminal with a reputation for preying on the vulnerable. He was appraising Maya with a sickening leer, predatory glint in his eyes as he circled her. "Good teeth, good hair. Young, you said?" 19. Stokes's voice was a gravelly rasp. "Fresh as a daisy, Shark. Just like we told ya," Reggie said, his voice a grotesque parody of a salesman's pitch. "DeSalle too, once she knows who's boss." Brenda chimed in, her tone sharp. "She'll do what she's told. Always has." Maya flinched, a small, wounded sound escaping her lips. She was being presented, sold, auctioned off like a piece of unwanted property by her own parents. The raw, unadulterated inhumanity of it slammed into Elijah with the force of a physical blow. It was a scene from a nightmare, something so vile it felt unreal, yet it was happening mere feet away. His breath hitched. All the wariness, the apathy that had clung to him like a shroud, was burned away in a sudden, white, hot flare of outrage. His moral compass, long neglected, but never broken, spun wildly, pointing him towards an action he hadn't yet conceived but knew, with bone-deep certainty, he had to take. The broke, grieving widower, the man with nothing left to lose and even less to offer, felt a forgotten fire ignite in his belly. He couldn't let this happen. He just couldn't. Elijah's mind raced, a frantic scramble of shock, fury, and a desperate need to act. He had no weapon, no authority, and the sum total of his worldly wealth wouldn't impress a pawn shop owner, let alone a man like Shark Stokes. He knew Reggie and Brenda were despicable, but this was a descent into a new kind of hell. He had to stop it, but how? A direct confrontation would be foolhardy, likely resulting in him getting seriously hurt and Maya's fate sealed. He scanned his immediate surroundings in the alley, a stack of loose bricks from a crumbling wall, a discarded metal trash can. An idea, reckless and half-formed, sparked in the desperate darkness of his thoughts. It was a long shot, relying on shock and bluff, but it was all he had. Taking a deep breath, Elijah hefted one of the heavier bricks. He moved to the side of the warehouse, near a section of corrugated iron sheeting that looked particularly loose. With a surge of adrenaline, he hurled the brick against the metal with all his might. The clang was deafening in the night's stillness, followed by him bellowing in his deepest, most authoritative voice, a voice he hadn't used since his counseling days, trying to break up youth fights. "Police! Stay where you are! We have the building surrounded!" Inside the warehouse, the effect was instantaneous. Stokes jumped back from Maya, his eyes darting towards the sound. Reggie and Brenda froze, their faces paling. "Cops. How the hell?" Reggie stammered. This was Elijah's cue. He kicked open the flimsy alley door, which surprisingly gave way with a splintering crack, and strode in, trying to project an aura of command he was far from feeling. He kept his hand inside his jacket, hoping they might think he was armed. "Reggie! Brenda! What in God's name do you think you're doing?" He boomed, his voice echoing in the vast space. He focused his glare on Stokes. "And you. I know who you are, Stokes. You want to add kidnapping and human trafficking to your rap sheet." Stokes, though initially startled, began to recover his composure, his eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you? There ain't no cops out there." He started to move, a predatory shift in his stance. Elijah stood his ground. "They're on their way. I made the call before I came in. And trust me, there are other people very interested in your business arrangements." He then turned his attention to the Collinses, his voice dropping to a deadly serious tone. "This girl, Maya, you're not selling her. Not tonight. Not ever." He saw the fear in their eyes, but also a dawning calculation. He had to offer them an out, however implausible. "Look," he said, trying to make his voice sound like he was offering a shady deal rather than a rescue. "There's been a misunderstanding. I heard she needed a new place, a guardian, someone to look after her properly." He pulled out his worn wallet, fumbling through the meager contents. He had $243 money for his overdue rent and electricity. It was everything. "Here," he said, pulling out the cash. "This is a down payment for her well-being. Consider it an advance on her proper care. You give her to me, I make sure she's taken care of, and nobody hears another word about this." He gestured vaguely at the sordid scene. He was banking on their greed and their immediate fear of exposure. Stokes scoffed. $200. You kidding me? But Reggie was looking at Elijah, then at the door, then back at Maya. The mention of other people, and Elijah's sheer, unexpected audacity seemed to have rattled him more than the threat of immediate police. Perhaps he thought Elijah was connected, a rival, someone who could bring them bigger trouble than they could handle. Brenda was whispering furiously in Reggie's ear. Suddenly, Reggie made a decision. He shoved Maya roughly towards Elijah. "Fine, take the brat." He spat, his eyes darting nervously towards the alley. He snatched the money from Elijah's hand. "She's more trouble than she's worth anyway. Just get her out of my sight before the real buyer shows up, and there's hell to pay." Stokes looked furious, but Reggie was already backing away, pulling Brenda with him. "Let's go, Bren. This ain't worth the heat." They scrambled out a back way Elijah hadn't noticed, disappearing into the darkness. Stokes lingered for a moment, his eyes burning into Elijah. "This ain't over, old man," he snarled. Then he too slipped away. Elijah's knees felt weak, his bluff suddenly collapsing like a house of cards. He turned to Maya. She was staring at him, her expression unreadable, a mixture of terror, confusion, and utter desolation. She was trembling violently. "It's okay," Elijah said, his voice now gentle, the adrenaline ebbing away to leave him shaky. "You're safe now. Come on." He extended a hand slowly, palm up. She flinched but didn't pull away. After a long moment, she allowed him to lead her out of the warehouse, away from the single, stark bulb that had illuminated her nightmare. He took her to his small, two-room apartment above a closed-down laundromat. It wasn't much, but it was clean, and for tonight, it was a sanctuary. He offered her the tiny spare room, which mostly held boxes of Sarah's old things. He gave her a clean shirt and a glass of water. She huddled on the edge of the cot, clutching herself silent. Elijah sat in his worn armchair in the other room, the weight of what he'd done, what he'd risked, settling upon him. He had bought a human being with his rent money. He had inserted himself into something dangerous and ugly. What Elijah didn't realize was that Reggie and Brenda Collins weren't just desperate, cruel parents. They were small, expendable cogs in a larger, uglier machine that preyed on the forgotten youth of Oakhaven. And Shark Stokes, cheated of his prize and his profit, had already made a call to people far more dangerous than Reggie Collins. The price of Maya's soul was far from settled. The first few days were a landscape of fragile silences and unspoken fears. Maya remained a ghost in Elijah's small apartment, moving with a wraith-like quietness, her eyes large and haunted in her pale face. She ate little, spoke less, and flinched at any unexpected sound or movement. Elijah understood. He'd seen trauma before in his years as a youth counselor. He knew it wasn't a fortress to be stormed, but a delicate, frozen thing that might thaw with warmth and patience. He didn't push. He left food for her on a small tray outside her door. He spoke softly when he needed to, telling her where the bathroom was, that she could use anything she needed. He found an old, half-used sketch pad and some pencils amongst Sarah's belongings. His wife had dabbled in drawing and left them on the small table in Maya's room without comment. For a day, they lay untouched. Then, he noticed faint pencil marks on the top sheet, hesitant, abstract lines. His apartment was sparse, but he tried to make it feel safe. He played soft jazz on an old radio, the music Sarah had loved, hoping its gentle melodies might soothe the jagged edges of Maya's fear. He talked to himself sometimes, narrating his simple actions, making coffee, washing dishes, just so the silence wouldn't feel so oppressive, so she would grow accustomed to his presence, his voice as non-threatening. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, cracks began to appear in the wall of Maya's silence. One morning, he found the sketch pad filled with intricate, almost feverish drawings of tangled thorns and shadowy figures, but in one corner, a tiny, perfectly rendered bird. He recognized a talent far beyond mere dabbling. Her parents hadn't just tried to sell her, they'd tried to smother a vibrant spark. He knew he couldn't protect her alone. The Collinses were cruel and greedy, and Stokes was a predator. They wouldn't simply let this go. Oakhaven was a small world, and secrets had a short lifespan. He needed help, official help. He thought of Lena Hansen, a detective he'd crossed paths with a few times during his community work. She was tough, no nonsense, but he'd sensed a core of fairness beneath her steely exterior. He found her number in an old address book. When he called, her voice was wary. Vance, Elijah Vance. Haven't heard that name in a while. What can I do for you? He told her the story, the words tumbling out, stark and unbelievable even to his own ears. The illegal auction, the Collinses, Stokes, his desperate intervention. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Mr. Vance, Detective Hansen finally said, her voice carefully neutral. That's a very serious accusation. You're telling me you interrupted a human trafficking event and essentially took the girl yourself. Do you have any proof of this auction? Elijah's heart sank. Just my word. And Maya's. But she's terrified. She's not ready to talk to anyone. I see, Hansen said, though Elijah felt she didn't, not really. Look, I know the Collinses have a history of neglect complaints. Nothing ever stuck hard. And Stokes is a known slimeball, but trafficking, that's a big leap without evidence. For all I know, you've taken a vulnerable girl from her legal guardians. Elijah felt a surge of frustration. She was being sold, detective. Sold? I'll make some inquiries, Vance, Hansen said, her tone unconvinced but not entirely dismissive. But you be careful. If what you're saying is true, these are dangerous people. And if it's not, well, you've put yourself in a very precarious position. Her words were a cold comfort, but it was a start. Meanwhile, the pressure began to mount. Reggie Collins, likely spurred by Stokes, and the loss of a more substantial payday, started making noise in the neighborhood. Elijah heard whispers that he, the quiet widower, had lost his mind, snatched the Collins girl. One evening, he found the lock on his apartment door tampered with, a clear warning. Stokes's shadowy associates were seen lingering near his building. Maya, sensing the shift, retreated further into herself, her eyes filled with a fresh wave of terror. They'll find me, she whispered one evening, her first full sentence to him, her voice hoarse from disuse. They always find me. Elijah's resolve hardened. Not this time, Maya, he said, his voice firmer than he felt. Not if I can help it. Behind the scenes, however, Detective Hansen, true to her word, had begun to pull a few strings. She ran background checks on Reggie and Brenda Collins, noting a pattern of child welfare reports that had mysteriously gone nowhere. She looked into Marcus Stokes's known associates and activities. A disturbing, albeit faint, outline of something ugly was beginning to emerge. Elijah's desperate story, which had initially sounded like the ravings of a troubled man, now held a disconcerting ring of possibility. What she didn't realize yet was how deep the rot went, or how close danger was circling Elijah and Maya. The subtle change in Maya began with her art. The sketchpad Elijah had given her became her voice, her sanctuary. The initial drawings of thorns and shadows slowly gave way to more defined images. Faces contorted with cruelty, her parents, Stokes, but also fleeting glimpses of Oakhaven landmarks, the grim warehouse, the alley. One day, Elijah found a detailed drawing of a battered, old ledger book, open to a page filled with scribbled names and numbers. "What's this, Maya?" he asked gently, pointing to the drawing. She looked at it, then at him, her eyes holding a flicker of something new, not just fear, but a nascent determination. "Daddy's book," she whispered. "Bad names, bad numbers." Elijah felt a jolt. "Do you know where he kept it?" She nodded, then described a loose floorboard in the Collinses' squalid apartment, a place she'd stumbled upon years ago. It was a risk, a huge one, but that ledger could be the proof Detective Hansen needed. The proof that could unravel whatever sordid enterprise the Collinses and Stokes were involved in. Armed with this new information, Elijah contacted Detective Hansen again. This time, her tone was different, more serious. "Vance, your hunch about Stokes. It's starting to connect to some other whispers we've been hearing about exploited runaways. Nothing solid, but it's there. This ledger Maya mentioned, if it exists, and if it contains what you suspect, it could be significant." Hansen couldn't officially sanction a break-in, but she didn't discourage Elijah from finding evidence that might have been misplaced by the Collinses. It was a gray area, but Elijah knew he had to try, leaving Maya with a trusted elderly neighbor from his old building, Mrs. Peterson, who knew a little of the situation and whose apartment felt like a fortress of kindness. Elijah, under the cover of a rainy night, made his way to the Collinses' apartment. The place was as grim as he'd imagined. He found the loose floorboard, exactly where Maya had described, and there it was, a stained, dog-eared ledger. A quick flip through its pages revealed a horrifying chronicle, names of young people, sums of money, dates, and cryptic notes. It was far worse than just Maya. It hinted at a systematic exploitation. As he was about to leave, he heard a key in the lock. Reggie Collins stumbled in, reeking of cheap liquor. Elijah ducked into a shadowed alcove, his heart pounding. Reggie grumbled, searched haphazardly for something, then, finding a bottle, slumped into a chair. Elijah slipped out moments later, the ledger clutched tightly under his jacket. He took it straight to Detective Hansen. This time, seeing the actual ledger, her professional skepticism transformed into focused resolve. This is big, Vance," she said, her eyes scanning the damning entries. "This gives us probable cause. We can start a real investigation now." Maya, hearing that the ledger was found, and that Detective Hansen believed them, seemed to shed another layer of her fear. She began to talk more, filling in details, describing other young people she'd seen come and go, faces that matched some of the names in the ledger. Her memory, sharpened by trauma, was precise. She even recalled overhearing Stokes bragging about a shipment due soon at the old warehouse. Her drawings became more purposeful, maps of the warehouse interior, sketches of Stokes's known associates. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a witness, actively participating in the fight for her own justice and that of others. The danger, however, intensified. Stokes, realizing the net might be closing and perhaps tipped off that someone was asking questions, became more brazen. One afternoon, as Elijah walked back from a grocery run, two of Stokes's thugs cornered him in an alley. "Shark wants his property back, old man," one of them growled, shoving him against a wall. "And he wants that book you found. Or things get real ugly for you and the girl." Elijah, though terrified, stood his ground, his old counselor's instinct kicking in. "She's not property," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "And you tell Stokes that Detective Hansen of the Oakhaven PD is very interested in his business practices." The mention of Hansen's name gave them pause. They roughed him up a bit, a warning, then melted away, but the message was clear. Time was running out. Stokes was desperate, and desperate men did desperate things. They had to act fast, using the information Maya and the ledger provided to set a trap before Stokes decided to cut his losses and disappear, or worse, silence them permanently. The unveiling of the truth was nearing its climax. Detective Hansen, armed with the ledger and Maya's increasingly coherent testimony, moved swiftly. The shipment Maya had overheard Stokes mentioning was their best chance, a potential trafficking exchange happening at the very warehouse where Elijah had first seen Maya. It was time to bring down not just the Collinses, but Marcus Stokes and whatever network he represented in Oakhaven. The plan was risky. They needed to catch Stokes and his associates in the act. Maya, showing a courage that astounded Elijah, agreed to play a crucial role. She wouldn't be bait in the traditional sense. Hansen was adamant about her safety, but her knowledge of the warehouse, layout, and Stokes's habits was invaluable for the surveillance and tactical approach. She helped Hansen's plainclothes team identify key access points and likely meeting spots within the derelict structure. The night of the supposed exchange was thick with tension. The warehouse, usually a silent monument to Oakhaven's decay, hummed with a nervous, illicit energy. Undercover officers were positioned all around. Elijah waited with Hansen in an unmarked car a block away, his hands clenched, his gaze fixed on the building. Maya was at a secure location, a specialized youth shelter Hansen had arranged, having already given her official statement. They watched as a van with blacked-out windows pulled up. Stokes emerged, along with two of his known enforcers. A short while later, Reggie and Brenda Collins arrived, looking shifty and anxious. They weren't expecting a shipment of new victims tonight. Hansen's team had learned Stokes had summoned them, likely to pressure them about Maya and the missing ledger, or perhaps to use them as a desperate, final leverage. The signal came. Stokes and the Collinses were inside, voices raised. Hansen's team moved in, swift and silent. From their vantage point, Elijah and Hansen heard shouted commands, the sounds of a brief scuffle, then an authoritative, "Police! You're all under arrest!" A few minutes later, which felt like an eternity to Elijah, Hansen's radio crackled. "All suspects in custody, detective. Scene is secure." Elijah let out a breath he hadn't realized he's been holding for days, maybe years. The aftermath was a whirlwind. Stokes, caught with incriminating evidence and facing multiple charges, including human trafficking, quickly realized his game was up. Reggie and Brenda Collins, confronted with the ledger and Maya's testimony, crumbled, their pathetic attempts at denial falling flat. The investigation, sparked by Elijah's desperate act and fueled by Maya's courage, began to unravel a local network that had preyed on vulnerable youth for years. Other names from the ledger led to more investigations, more potential rescues. Elijah was interviewed extensively, his initial, almost unbelievable story now validated. He wasn't a kidnapper or a vigilante, but a citizen who had dared to intervene. He was hailed in the local news, quietly, as a hero, though he shied away from the attention. His only concern had been Maya. Maya, now in a supportive and therapeutic environment, began to truly heal. With Elijah's continued visits, he had become a steadfast, fatherly presence in her life, and the help of dedicated counselors. She started to reclaim her voice, her future. The art supplies Elijah had first given her became her tools for expression and recovery. Her talent, once a secret, hidden thing, blossomed. The broader impact on Oakhaven was palpable. A shadow had been lifted, a hidden wound exposed and beginning to be cleansed. Community groups, inspired by the story, rallied to create better support systems for at-risk youth. Elijah, though still struggling financially, found a renewed sense of purpose. He started volunteering at a local youth center, his old skills and newfound quiet authority making a tangible difference. He wasn't sure what the future held for his career, but he knew he couldn't go back to just existing. He needed to help. Several months later, the youth center hosted a small art exhibit showcasing the work of young local artists. One section was dedicated to Maya. Her paintings were raw, powerful, filled with dark shadows but also with bursts of vibrant color, of emerging light. One piece, titled Echoes of Silence, Colors of Hope, depicted a dark alleyway with a single, warm light emanating from a distant window and two figures walking towards it. It was dedicated simply for Elijah stood before it, tears welling in his eyes, not of sorrow, but of a profound, quiet joy. Maya, standing beside him, slipped her hand into his. She was smiling, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. She was no longer the terrified girl in the warehouse. She was an artist, a survivor, a young woman stepping into her own light. And so, Elijah Vance's courageous intervention, transforming him from a broke widower burdened by his own grief into a beacon of hope, and Maya's journey from a silenced victim to a young woman finding her voice and future, serves as a powerful reminder that compassion and bravery can illuminate the darkest corners, and that one person standing against injustice can spark profound change. If this story of resilience, the fight against exploitation, and the power of human connection stirred something in you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring narratives about people who turned adversity into triumph. What was the most impactful moment for you in Elijah and Maya's story?